We could start, right? Uh, yeah, wonderful. Okay, let me call upon Priyadarshini to introduce Madhavi Jha. Madhavi, welcome to this program, and as a
Thank you.
formal, introduction, Priyadarshini will do. Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Simi Priyadarshini, and today it's both my honor and privilege to be able to introduce you to Madhavi Jha, a speaker for the second Grameen Talk series. She has a great understanding and a great sense of appreciation what truly makes the subject gender and caste on famine public workers in colonial North India. Madhavi Jha Madam graduated from Delhi University with a degree in BA in History, and she has done her Masters in Development Studies from TIS, Mumbai. Madhavi Jha Madam carried out her PhD dissertation on laboring women and public works in colonial North India at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. And now she is currently engaged in preparing a book manuscript on history of women construction workers. Her interest areas include labor, gender, caste, social history, and economic history. You can also read her published work at Men Diggers and Women Carriers, Gendered Work on Famine, Public Works in Colonial North India, in International Review of Social History. She is just a fascinating person, and we are all in for cognizance on gender and caste on famine public workers in colonial North India. Without a further ado, please join me in welcoming Madhavi Jha Madam. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction.
You're welcome,
Can I
ma'am.
start, Shahul?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just share my screen because this is also, there's a PowerPoint element to this. So, okay. So can you see the screen that I've
Madhavi,
shared?
you can take 40 minutes for talk. Yeah. We'll have question answer session after that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Just a second. So can you see my screen that I've shared?
Yes, we can.
And am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, once again. And thank you for allowing me to present my research. It has been both easy and difficult to work on this topic. Easy because there aren't many works on this particular topic in history, and difficult because of the precise reason why there aren't many works on this particular topic. Women have always worked. It would seem that in stating this, one is stating the rather obvious, the banal. Every human being, after all, engages in a number of activities to sustain herself. However, it has taken an interplay of various factors to unidentify what women do for everyday sustenance as work or labor. The history of this process has, among other things, also been intrinsically related to the history of social organization, of the emergence of the family in its current forms, and shaped our understanding of gender. In the common understanding, there's either complete silence on the relationship of gender and labor, or perhaps worse,
Some connection problem, it seems.
Sir, I think ma'am has lost the connection.
Okay, just wait, I think.
So she got disconnected.
Okay.
I think I got disconnected in the middle.
Yeah. Now you can share your screen.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I am sorry. I don't know where I got disconnected. So,
Madhvi, you were speaking about the silence on gender and labor. That's the precise point. It got disconnected.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. It silenced me at the
That
And
made
that's
you
the
silence.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Uh, all right. So as I was saying, in the common understanding, there's either complete silence on the relationship of gender and labor, or perhaps worse, essentialist understanding of biology are forwarded to explain women's relationship with work, both waged and unwaged. And these then go on to shape the wider notions of women's sexuality, family, and so on. In the context of South Asia, as in many parts of the world outside Europe and America, much of the social reproduction activities was rooted in the peasant subsistence economy in rural areas. This implied a continued dependence of the male wage earner on the waged and unwaged work of women and children. Far from seeing this as an incomplete modernization of colonized nations, it is argued that all these forms of labor were crucial for capitalist development. This was an important formative feature of the working population in India and continues to have implications still today. For instance, the reason given by most employers for not providing social security to their workers in the 20th century was that workers went back to their villages during sickness and old age, and indeed also during marriages and festivals and so on. In the last 6 months of the COVID pandemic, migrants walking back to their villages are a grim reminder of the continued rural connection of the urban working population. Labor history, the historiography within which I partially place my work, was for long dominated by studies of organized labor in industrial spaces. And this led to marginalization of women along with others as credible laboring subjects for historical analysis. While rural labor itself formed part of major debates in history, like free and unfree labor, mode of production debate, and so on, this in itself did not produce many histories of women's work. Since the late 1980s, there have been studies on women within the industrial workforce, as well as the role of gender in the evolution of working class families, as well as their location in the migration and so on. However, much work remains to be done. One of the reasons why historians have shied away from working on the particular intersection of gender and labor has been the lack of historical evidence. This is a problem faced by historians of labor in South Asia in general and becomes particularly prominent while writing histories of women's work. Public works are not an exception to this. Public works construction, that is, the construction of road, railways, canals, and tanks in the second half of the 19th century was carried out through an elaborate system of contracting and subcontracting by departments like the PWD, which is the Public Works Department, railways, military department, and so on. As such, there is no organized data like continuous labor contracts or continuous payrolls that have survived within the archives of these departments. It is even more difficult to get records of women. This is in contrast to the actual large numbers in which women worked. It is estimated that about 80% of the 10 million workers who worked on railway construction in the second half of 19th century, 80% of them were engaged in what is considered to be the unskilled task of digging and carrying earth. And this number included women and children in large proportions. However, I did find some records. In the interest of time, I will show you one of the earliest sketches I could procure from the British Library. Samuel Carrington, a civil engineer, in a letter to his mother narrating his travel experiences in 1857, also drew a few sketches for sake of illustration. These were copied by his mother on a separate notebook to read out to her friends. Both the copy and original letters are preserved as private papers in the British Library. Writing from Allahabad on his travels, Carrington informed his mother, and I quote, "There are 2,000 men and women at work in the station yard. Perhaps you may think it's strange to hear of women at work, but in this country, they do all the earth carrying," unquote. So this text was accompanied by two sketches. So this is what his mother had drawn. And I was a bit puzzled by this drawing before I saw the original letter from which she was trying to copy. So this is the original letter. And as you can see, there's a photo of a woman with a rather large nose ring, and she has a basket on her head. as well as there's a sketch of, there's a photo of the sketch drawn by Samuel Carrington. Who were these thousands of men and women working at the railway yard in Allahabad in 1857? There were two types of construction workers. Those who were drawn from the rural labor market, and those who were termed as the professional digging caste by engineers of the PWD, the Public Works Department. For example, the most common term to denote caste on construction work in North India was Bengal, in North India and Bengal was Beldar or Bildar. In Punjab, Oaths were one such caste. Women were recruited as part of family units which worked in a gang system. They were usually engaged in digging and carrying earth using basic tools like spades and baskets, and it hasn't changed much. The problem of archival evidence for me was solved through famine records. There were recurrent famines and scarcities in the second half of the 19th century. What distinguished this period from famines in earlier times was an organized effort at relief by the colonial state on a large scale. Famine public works were one of the central ways in which relief was provided. The contemporary view of famines in colonial India was that famines occurred due to shortage of work and not grains. The agricultural laboring classes were seen as the mainly affected by this shortage of work. Consequently, construction work, mainly digging and carrying earth, was given out on public works in return for subsistence wage. So this is one of the sketches taken from the Illustrated London News, a newspaper, from May 1897. If the image is clear for you, you can see both men and women working, they're carrying baskets and so on. So this is tank digging on one of the famine relief works, I think in Bengal. I'm not very sure, but I think in Bengal, in the province of Bengal. The organization of famine public works responded to two imperatives of the colonial state: the economy of governance and the efficiency of governance. Further, it was shaped by the existing ideologies of colonial welfare as well as labor. Women formed around 50% of the laboring population on famine public works. In famine public works, the need to calculate an age and gender differentiated minimum wage, which was based on diet, meant that women were individuated as laborers. Their diet, work, and wage became matters of discussion for the government, which had become the main employer for these women, because while I said in non-famine public works, contract and subcontract was a very important feature, contract work was not considered desirable on famine public works. It then becomes possible to write the history of women's work on these famine works through the famine records. These famine records include the proceedings of the PWD, the Revenue and Agricultural Department, as well as famine codes. Famine codes were formulated from time to time, both at the level of provinces. So provinces are states much larger than today's states, but what you would consider today's states, and center. And these famine codes guided what would be the rules on famine public works. The three important famine commissions were written in 1880, 1898, and 1901. And along with their evidence volumes, they are very useful to write this history. Famines, understandably, also attracted a lot of writing from non-government sources, including missionaries, as well as the national and international press. If you're curious about the gendered notions of work and remuneration, especially, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you're curious about the gendered notions of work and remuneration, especially the way the sexual division of labor operated on famine public works, I invite you to read the paper that has been circulated with the abstract of this talk. In this presentation, my task is somewhat different. I analyze how women's labor and mobility for work reproduced caste. My aim is to show two things. First, that the practices on famine public works emerged as a result of a shared understanding between the colonial state and the rural elite. And second, that these practices had specific implications for women from laboring castes. Throughout the presentation, I will be using terms like better caste, higher caste, upper caste, and lower caste. And these are archival terms along with the names of particular castes. So these are to be imagined within quotes as archival terms. These are to be distinguished from terms like marginalized, dominant, laboring or non-laboring castes. This difference should be amply clear in the context of the sentence, but please feel free to ask me if I am being vague. It will be useful here to identify the gaps in our existing knowledge that this paper could possibly fill. I have identified two historiographical trends within which this work can be placed. First is the interconnectedness of labor, gender, and caste, and second is the short distance migration of women. While the relationship between labor, gender, and caste has been acknowledged in the context of South Asia within social sciences, within the specific discipline of history, frameworks focusing on all three have been relatively less used. Broadly, two kinds of historical interrogation tell us something about these interconnected identities. First include the works that have explored the divergent impact of colonial laws on women coming from different castes, affecting their labor, sexuality, property rights, and so on. Second are the historians of women's labor, who have pointed out the centrality of caste in the type of work women did and the site of their work. In the industrial context, historians have pointed out the role of caste and gender hierarchies in the formation of working class femininity and also in the maintenance of class divisions. Particularly, in the 20th century, the growing influence of male breadwinner ideology among the industrial classes has been analyzed. Here, it is pertinent to note that there has been a growing alignment throughout the 20th century of wider gender norms with dominant caste rules regarding women's work and presence in public spaces. In both urban and rural contexts, the space, for example, working in your own field or working in someone else's field, as well as the visibility of women's work, notably the different adoptions and adaptations of parda and seclusion, were fundamental to the self-fashioning of respectability of different castes. However, these very markers of respectability, that is the space and visibility of women's work, were subject to change, especially under economic pressures that were exerted on laboring households. Famines and scarcities of the late 19th century represented one such moment of economic crisis for large sections of rural laboring population. And this presentation analyzes the ways in which deployment of women's labor as a response to economic hardships was incorporated into the formations of caste. The second historiographical context of this work is the gendered aspects of migration. Despite the excellent work on women's long-distance overseas migration as indentured labor, the overwhelming picture of migration and circulation in 19th and early 20th century India has been gendered. That is, the mobile urban laboring man and his counterpart, the rural woman with limited mobility and decreasing role in wage labor. The mobilities engendered on family public works can be located in a continuum of the rather common, though not very well researched, short distance migration of women for agricultural work. The implications of this type of migration has not been explored much in the existing historiography. So these 2 points, the history of identities of laboring classes and migration, will be useful to keep in mind as I tell my story. The story starts from the second half of the 19th century with recurrent famines and scarcities in almost all parts of India that threatened to bring into question the very so-called fitness of British rule. Why should the British rule India, right? So that question was brought to the fore because of these famines. So on your screens, you can probably see a compilation of the recorded famines. So these are recorded famines, so there may be many more. As you can see, it is widespread and consistent throughout this period, the second half of the 19th century. Among other concerns, famine also drew the attention of colonial state because of the migrations that occurred during famines. People's movement between different regions during famines were guided by availability of resources and work, and also their caste and kinship networks. For the colonial state, it was important to identify and differentiate what they considered the organized movements of laborers and what they characterized as aimless wandering of people. The employability of migrants, the circularity or seasonality of migrants, the customary or habitual paths of migration were signs of so-called good migration for the colonial state. The state's concern over fodder famine, that is famine of fodder, things that cattle eat, right? That's fodder. and the fate of cattle during famines reflected its larger interest in the viability of peasant farming. Two factors, hence, property and labor, went into demarcating good migration from what was considered bad migration. The colonial state's intervention in the form of famine works also became an occasion for the state to demarcate between what they considered as good and bad movement of people. I will mainly be basing my arguments on evidence from two British provinces, Punjab and Northwestern provinces. So this is a map of Punjab. This dates to 1907 to 1909. It's taken from the Imperial Gazetteer of India. And this is the map of United Provinces. The Northwestern Provinces was renamed United Provinces in 1902. And both these Northwestern Provinces and United Provinces roughly correspond to the present day Uttar Pradesh. In this presentation, I will first analyze the reasons that led to the division of famine public works, and then division of famine public works into village and departmental works. I will then present a comparative study of the sex ratio between these two types of works to answer the question of who worked where and why. But before that, allow me to say a few words on caste in general on famine public works. As mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, agricultural laborers were the main target of famine public works, as they were assumed to be one of the worst hit by the loss of employment. This meant that the majority of women working on famine public works came from laboring castes that either did not own land or owned very little land. Within the famine records, there is some evidence of women coming from dominant castes like Brahmins and Thakurs working on famine public works. For instance, in March 1874, the Government of India set up an inquiry to verify the claims made in a newspaper called London Daily News that, I quote, hundreds of high caste women are to be seen laboring on government relief works with common coolies, unquote. This news had been reported from the Bengal province. The subsequent inquiry concluded that while the presence of certain high caste women on famine public works was not out of ordinary in this region, the conditions of scarcity in that year were not severe enough to, I quote, drive the better classes to great extremities, unquote. In Etawah, from Northwestern provinces, the case of one Thakur widow was mentioned separately in a report from 1906. She was identified as the only woman on the famine public works who was of a good caste, and special care was taken to transfer her to a nearby canal work. Caste census in the same year on a portion of canal work in the same province showed that out of the 428 women working on the construction of the canal, 2 were Brahmins, 5 were Thakurs, while 102 women were from the Kori caste and 171 belonged to the Chamar caste. Hence, women from dominant castes were present on famine public works, but in small numbers. Notably, women from such castes were described as exceptions in the famine records. In fact, in the case of Bengal province cited above, we see that the very presence of women and their number from these castes is taken as proof of the severity of famines. A different type of relief provided to women from upper caste household who were identified as Parda Nashi. Parda Nashi literally means the veiled. Parda. These women were allotted work that they could do within their houses. They were given doles or put to tasks such as spinning cotton or grinding grains. Even missionaries were involved in providing such work to women at home, and missionaries distinguished such type of work from that done on famine public works. And missionaries described the work done on famine public works as rough work. Caste was also an important factor in determining the rules and regulations around food and water distribution on famine public works. Water distribution on famine public works was a matter of great concern to the relief administrators because one of the major fears was the spread of cholera at this time. The rules formulated to reduce the chances of spread of cholera among relief laborers were aligned with caste rules of purity and pollution. There were also what was called sweeper gangs that were responsible for maintaining hygiene in the camps. And these were composed wholly of what were considered untouchable castes. So this is a sketch from 1901 from the Punjab province. As you can see in the sketch, the huts of sweeper gangs are separated from others. Unfortunately, these features do not come to us as a surprise, as they resonate with the discriminatory practices that continue to plague the different contemporary relief programs. While these aspects of caste are apparent and comparatively easier to recover from the records, what requires closer scrutiny is the way in which caste and gender interacted to produce certain types of mobilities around work and relief. For this, we turn to the spatial organization of relief works, aspects of distance, scale, and agency. Without going into too many details, my purpose is to distinguish between what was called village works and departmental works. As mentioned before, the rationale of economy and efficiency guided the rules of famine relief. One of the major concerns at famine public works was to determine the genuine relief seekers. Different types of tests were devised to ensure that the famine public works did not prove to be too attractive to laborers who were not affected by famine or scarcity, or in other words, could find work. One of these tests was the distance test. Distance test implied that only those people who were in actual need during times of famine and scarcity would travel a certain distance from their residence to avail the relief on famine public works. Those who did not pass the distance test were deemed to be not in real requirement of relief. This test was, however, found to be unsuitable during famine conditions. While it was agreed that works need not be provided very close to laborers' homes, it was apparent that the distance test could not be applied practically. In fact, it was found by the Famine Commission report of 1898 that the distribution of famine relief works varied from province to province and depended on a different set of factors in every province. For example, the higher density of population in Bengal as opposed to northwestern provinces and Punjab meant that the famine public works had to be nearer to each other in Bengal, so on and so forth. The various distinctions of famine public works were based A, on the number of people working, so large or small, and B, on the agency through which famine public works was carried out, which were departmental and village works. The division of works into small or large depended on the number of people on works. For example, in 1878, the range for small works was taken to be 300 to 500 laborers. Large works would average about 6,000 people in the province of northwestern provinces and Punjab in the 1890s. Village works were works constructed within a group or within a village or a group of villages that were carried out by the revenue department, private individuals, or both. The emphasis in village works was on the utilization of local resources and agencies, which included work being carried out through middlemen like zamindars and headmen. The role of PWD was limited to technological advice in the case of village works. In these works, the mobilization of labor came to be heavily dependent on the village elites. Sometimes the term large and departmental works were used interchangeably to denote public works under the supervision of duty. I will henceforth use the term departmental works to denote works carried out by the PWD as distinguished from village works. Divergent opinions were expressed over the relative usefulness of departmental works and village works. Village works were considered advantageous, especially as the private employers considered them less interfering in the labor market. Departmental works carried out by the PWD were criticized on several grounds, including their apparent attractiveness for workers because of task work and minimum wage that was stipulated in the different codes and which were implemented with varying degrees in the provinces. This minimum wage was calculated on a bare minimum diet required to stay alive and was calculated on basis of jail diets. Nonetheless, private employers argued that the wages given on these works, these large departmental works, raised the overall wages of rural labor and amounted to labor market interference by the state. As I mentioned earlier, the use of contractors and subcontractors was much decreased under the famine codes. Despite these criticisms of departmental works, the different government reports continued to emphasize their importance. For example, in 1898, the Famine Commission stated that departmental work should be the backbone of famine relief. Similarly, in 1901, the Famine Commission report upheld departmental works, I quote, not only as an alternative, but also as a safeguard, unquote. The question then naturally arises, safeguard against what? who traveled outside the village to work on departmental works opened by the PWD, and what factors impelled the higher reliance on departmental works. To answer these questions, let us pay greater attention to village works. Before that, let me just mention in passing, as I will not be going into details now, that there are some very interesting aspects of residence of laborers on public works. If I had the time to only make one point about it, I would say that the hutting of laborers on departmental works was viewed primarily from a sanitary by the relief administrators. The congregation of laborers in large numbers was seen as fertile ground for spread of diseases like cholera. The question of laborers' residence was always clubbed together with questions like sanitation, conservancy, ventilation, and so on, and as such was not a concern for their shelter. The Famine Commission reports were cautious when speaking about village works. This wariness about village works stemmed from the ground reports on the composition of laborers on departmental and village works. For example, in 1896 in Banda district in northwestern provinces, the engineer made inquiries regarding the composition of laborers on departmental works. It was revealed that there were a large number of women, including widows, laboring on these works. Further, it was found that the bulk of those present on departmental works belonged to castes such as Chamars and Kols. The report noted the absence of Brahmins and Thakurs on these works. At the same time, in Etawah, in northwestern provinces again, 50 village works had been sanctioned. It was reported that while these works were sufficient for the employment of high caste laborers, it was necessary to provide large departmental works for Chamars and other castes. Similarly, in Bara, the collector expressed the problems in making the collector of that district expressed the problems in making village relief system work in this district. He stated that the zamindars did not give employment to those, I quote, most in need of it and excluded the low caste and non-residents, unquote. What then was the vision behind village works? The question for us is, did the colonial relief system simply buckle under the pressures exerted by rural elites, or was it a result of a shared understanding of social stratification and its basis in colonial rural India? The rationale given for village works by colonial officials throw some light on this matter. In Ambala district of Punjab province in 1896, one of the stated advantages of digging tanks as a relief measure was that it could provide relief to the landowning classes. This was in response to the reluctance of certain castes to work on departmental works. The notion of shame attached to digging was identified with 3 castes in this region by the colonial officials: Rajputs, Jats, and Gujars. The experience of famines in Karnal in 1869 was cited to argue that these castes had refused to work on roads even when famines had been severe. Further, it was stated that their refusal to work was linked to these castes' strong bond with their homes. This was contrasted with the neighboring caste tendency to emigrate for work anyway. I quote, and it was stated, and I quote, in famine time, Kamin and Kangal has no particular home, unquote. These caste distinctions were also used to justify the division of work provided as relief. Hence, while mooting the idea of digging tanks as appropriate for village works, it was argued that, and it's a rather long quote, so I've put it on the slide. So this is what it was argued, and I quote, the tank system finds great favor in my mind, and in order to render it acceptable to zamindars, and in order to prevent this class of labor from quickly giving out, I am inclined to let it be known that tanks are for the zamindars and for Kangals the roads. There is no great hardship to the laborer in this. He is accustomed to seek work and can take his family with him and has no home of value to leave behind. On the other hand, zamindars will shy away from work if they are to be mixed up with Kangals, unquote. Further evidence of this attitude was provided from one particular village in this district called Lukhi. In this village, Rajputs agreed to work on tanks if they were assured that the work would be reserved for the zamindars. It was reported that the Rajputs in this village were agreeable to the idea, I quote, that Kangals would go and work like coolies on roads while they would be asked to dig together at home in a gentlemanly way, unquote. Finally, it was argued that in the absence of such an exclusive arrangement of relief for these castes, they would resort to borrowing and lead to further indebtedness of these places. This last point was particularly important in Punjab at this time because there was an ongoing debate on land alienation caused by indebtedness and state's role in protecting the peasants against such alienation of land. The understanding of the objectives of village works was occurring in Punjab, which we saw from the province of Punjab, was reiterated by the Famine Commission report of 1898 and codified as rules. It recognized, the report recognized that departmental work served a bigger population of laborers who were not only accustomed to the type of work provided in departmental works, but also to going a certain distance from their homes to work. Echoing the Punjab case, it was stated that, I quote, no special hardship involved in this so far as majority of workers are concerned, unquote. However, the report recognized that there was another class of people in villages who would not avail of the work provided in the departmental works, who, and again, this is a longish quote, so I put it here. So the FCR, the Famine Commission report of 1898 states, and I quote, though poor and leading a simple village life and accustomed to labor in their own fields, belong to a much higher stratum of society than the ordinary laborers. The women in most places work in association with their male relations, but they do not hire themselves out to other cultivators. Far less go out of the villages in quest of employment, unquote. It was pointed out that this class of people could not be expected to work in departmental works with its, I quote again, privations and inconveniences, its enforced companionship of strangers and exposure of their womankind to the familiarities of all manner of men gathered together at relief camp, unquote. Clearly then, in the view of British administrators, a uniform labor test failed to ascertain the relief requirements of those affected by famines and scarcity. It was suggested that the landowning cultivators be relieved through a different class of works that required labor, but removed the necessity of associating with the laboring castes. The understanding that village works were meant for relief of non-laboring castes in the villages led to what was known as a conscious policy of selection. This policy meant that the village elites were the preferred subjects of relief through village work. This is further proven by reports from different districts in northwestern provinces in 1906, where two particular castes, Thakurs and Brahmins, were preferred over others. So I will now be speaking about the places that are marked in this map, if you can see it. So I think I'll just, yeah. So now I think you can see the one. So this is part of northwestern provinces. So for example, in Ghatampur Tehsil of Kanpur district, work was being carried out on 6 tanks with the condition that, I quote, low caste people are not allowed on this work, unquote. In Unnao, there was also a special selection of village works expressly for Thakurs and Brahmins, and it was agreed to send to, I quote, send the lower classes of residents of this village to public works, unquote. And there are many more examples of this very conscious policy of selection in this particular province, but I'll not go into the details. What did this policy of segregation of relief seekers according to caste mean for women? So that is our main concern now. A closer look at the relief statistics on different types of work suggests some patterns. The number of women and men on famine public works was almost equal in most parts of the country. In many cases, the number of women was also higher than men. However, in order to map the gendered pattern of mobility, we have to examine the gender segregated data on different types of works. We have this type of data from 5 districts in northwestern provinces, Etawah, Agra, Kanpur, Mutra, and Hamirpur for the year of 1906. This data has been collated by me from the fortnightly reports from these districts that were submitted as part of routine famine reporting. While sometimes the exact numbers were subject to revisions, the data is interesting in the pattern of sex ratio that it reveals. I have calculated the sex ratio as number of women working per 100 men in both departmental work and village works in these 5 districts. For the purposes of time, I will show the tabulated data for 2 districts and then a bar graph, then bar graphs for all the districts that I have. As you can see in the data from Agra, from 31st March 26th May, the sex ratio on departmental works ranged from 198 to 286. Hence, there was no case of unfavorable sex ratio on departmental works. The data on village works in this district is available from 31st March to 7 July, and the range for sex ratio was 26 to 118, with only 2 out of 14 entries showing a sex ratio favorable to women. Then the second example I want to share with you is from Kanpur. Here the data in this district, the data is available from 27 January to 18th August. The sex ratio on departmental works ranges from 115 to 79. The range of sex ratio on village works from 10th February to 18th August was 15 to 92. In this district, the sex ratio was unfavorable on departmental works in 6 out of 10 entries. However, in all cases barring one, the sex ratio was above 90. In contrast, on village works, where sex ratio was unfavorable in all cases, the sex ratio was usually below 50. So this is the bar graph. Agra and Kanpur we've already seen. Etawah, we don't have many comparable figures, but there are individual figures, but not comparable for the same fortnight, which make the same point. And these are again two further two districts, so Muttra and Hamirpur. As you can see, the pattern is quite clear. The blue is departmental works, the green is village works. And yeah, a very clear pattern hence emerges. Women worked in larger numbers and in larger proportions than men on PWD projects. Their presence on village works was very low. This meant that women moved out of villages much more than men to seek work on large departmental works. Further, that these women belong to laboring castes. The larger number of women than men on departmental works can be explained by the fact that there were fewer opportunities for these women to find work than men, even from the same caste, during famines. Overall, women were not the preferred workforce by private employers, whether inside or outside the villages. However, what is interesting is the reversal of sex ratio between village works and departmental works. Village works were clearly reserved for the upper caste men. In the process of selection of village works for dominant castes, a certain kind of mobility was ensured, that of the laboring caste women outside their villages. We have seen earlier that the distance that women would have to go, would have to go from their residence to work differed from province to province. Further, women laborers would either reside on these works or come back to their villages. The definition of better castes centered on two aspects, labor and property. While it was argued that the labor of the kind provided on family public works, that is digging or carrying, was itself distasteful for the dominant caste, what was even more abhorrent to them was the association and proximity of doing this work along with laboring castes on the same site. Moreover, it was pointed out that while women of these better castes labored on fields, they did not usually work outside their own household and family units. It was not possible to maintain this type of segregation on departmental works. Hence, where women worked and with whom they worked was one of the markers of caste and respectability. Laboring women had been pushed out of the villages through the system of selection applied to the village works. In reserving village works for the upper caste, the colonial state had not only secured relief for them during famines, but also reproduced castes through hierarchies of famine relief works. And this reproduction of caste structures was enabled through the specific movement of women from laboring castes in search of work outside their villages. In the second half of the 19th century, the colonial state was concerned about preserving its revenue base in India, which was the peasant households. And in the process of preserving its revenue base, the colonial state also continually defined them through property and labor, the peasant households, that is. Property rights were key to the very formation of the ideal colonial rural, which was constituted by the village and which necessarily included sedentarization of itinerant population. Itinerant means circulatory population, institutionalizing property rights both within law as well as custom, and classifying the habits and history of groups of people as agricultural or non-agricultural. One implication of this process for the laboring castes was their very definition as laboring. While caste-based extraction of labor, including forced labor, intensified in this period, they were divested of the customary ownership and usage claim over land. In case of what was called untouchable caste or Dalit caste, This meant complete erasure of their agrarian history. Historians have elaborated the role, agency, and collusion of the rural elite in this process. The present work, while locating famine public works within these broad trends of late 19th century colonial India, foregrounds the role of women's labor in the construction and sustenance of rural stratification. In its treatment of different types of people who migrated during famines, propertied and non-propertied, laboring and non-laboring, the colonial state operated through certain binaries that informed their understanding of the colonized population. Hence, we see that in the case of famine public works, the settled peasant groups were pitted against the mobile laboring classes and castes. The former, that is the settled peasant groups, were attributed a strong sense of home and respectable labor. On the other hand, the circulation of the laboring classes was characterized as a dislocation. Further, premised on their lower caste identity, their labor and the very site of the labor was constructed as degrading. I have argued in the past 40 minutes or so that the laboring women's movement for work was fundamental to the ideological and material constructions that inform these binaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhavi. It's a very fascinating, understanding, especially the connection you draw between caste, gender, and the labor involved in that, and especially the colonial state, how it works in this context. Thanks again for completing on time, and it's like the precision you follow, both in terms of time and content, really need appreciation. So now I will open this forum for question answers, and Rahul is there. Rahul, you are there, right? Yeah, Rahul.
Rahul Lutava.
Yeah. Rahul may take care of the questions in chat box, and you can ask question directly to Madhavi. Yeah, others.
I have a question actually. If I can just kick off the question and answer session to Madhavi. Madhavi, what are the continuities and discontinuities with say gendered rural work in an MG Narega, and how would that compare with say with your findings, with your specific kind of findings? That is one question. I mean, in terms of the connections between the past and the present. And I think secondly, could you tell us a little bit about remuneration? Because at least, I mean, in Karnataka, where I'm from, the Gandalu and the Hennalu, which are separate wages which are paid to men and women for work, etc. Do they feature in the colonial record, and how is that navigated? Are there caste differences in the remuneration as well? Thank you.
Should I answer this right away? And then more questions? Or
Yeah. Then
yeah.
you could. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for those questions, Amit, because so this is one of the most common questions that I face about Manrega, because it sounds, anybody who hears this, it sounds very, very familiar to Manrega. So some of the, of course, there are continuities, because a lot has not changed in terms of women not being the preferred workforce for private employers, right? So I said that in my presentation, and that continues till today in rural India. Some of the things, if people who've been following Manrega, some of the debates around them, one striking similarity was that the Farmers Association had, in some places, had spoken about how Manrega was raising the wages of rural India in certain places, and there was actually a protest against it. And a lot of state governments, including Uttar Pradesh and so on, very recently started acting on those kinds of demands. So to that extent, yes, and that is of course to do with the fact that the Manrega, as a policy measure, has two things. One is that it necessarily requires inclusion of women, Manrega. And that is, again, very similar to famine public works, because there, as I said, 50%, sometimes more, used to be women. So just the presence of women in large numbers in a certain work site has its own, would have similar, similar kind of results, I would imagine. The second similarity is, of course, wage parity. Wage parity was also made part of Manrega as part of the law. And here also there's not much difference that exists between men and women, the difference. So the idea that when women in laboring households come out and work in large numbers, and then they, and that is seen as raising the overall rural wage, so to say. So that's an interesting, I think that's very interesting, that because it not only tells us about the factors that keep women away from wage work, but also the exact forces that keep women out of the workforce. So this doesn't mean that people are paying something very extra to women. It only means that people are surviving at very, very low rates, because after all, both Manrega as well as Famine Public Works are sustenance level wages. What this means is that, yeah. Amit, you're trying to say something?
No. I just had a follow-up question, but please complete, and then
I thought you were. Yeah. So because these are very, this just means that if these, in case of Manrega cash flow, in case of Famine Public Works, if these works were not given out, people would actually die. So, but even in that case, when women start working, and there's some very fascinating discussion between private employers and the colonial officials about, oh, so you're paying so much, and then they, both of them compare how much does a laborer require to laboring, what is the laboring family, how much do they require to eat to, and then and you know, it becomes grotesque. At sometimes it also becomes funny. But so yeah, so there are very similarities. The second thing is about remuneration. Caste differences in remuneration, I have not come across, because as I said, most of the people who were working were actually from laboring castes. So most of them already came from caste. There's a fixed rural wage around which they were earning. But what I would imagine must have happened is also the difference between mates and the rest of them. So mates are usually people who are higher than, who are sort of first among equals. And so because, as I said, this is a gang system. Even today, construction work, you have gang system in place. So a number of men, women, children get together, and they usually belong to the same caste. But the mate, and also, yes, I do have records to show that mates and laborers did belong to similar, usually followed kinship and caste lines. But the mate, of course, got a little more. Yeah. So the other lines around which there was a wage difference was professional laborers and non-professional laborers. And so those professional laborers again were the caste that, as I said, had been identified in the early years, in the early 19th century to middle 19th century by the PWD engineers as navvy castes. Navvy in British context meant navvies were basically gangs of construction workers who went from project to project and were considered especially skilled in construction work, because digging and carrying also requires skill. So they had identified certain castes. So in Karnataka, for example, there's a fascinating work by someone called Ian Kerr, who works on this particular caste, who work in the region, broad region of Karnataka, Andhra, and so on. So they were actually valued for their skills as professional diggers. So, but it wouldn't be large. The other thing is that wages, the difference in caste wages also we won't get to know so easily, because as I said, there was a system of contracting and subcontracting. So what you actually got was that a contractor would get a certain fixed amount for piece work. So there's a difference in task work and piece work, right? So piece work is there's a certain amount that you do, and it is, say, 5 rupees per this cubic meter earthwork is the contract, is given to someone who then gives it to someone who gets the laborers together and they do the work. This is pretty much how even today work is being done. So it's difficult to get, but these are some of my, so it would be based on caste networks, it would be based on professional who were considered to be professional laborers, and it would be based on, also one can even see that some kind of, so as I mentioned, the sweeper caste, so they were probably paid less, but not on the basis of the work that did, but because their work was completely different from, it was about hygiene and upkeep. Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah,
just
that's my,
just one follow-up question, Shahul, if I may.
Yeah, please go ahead.
sure.
Madhvi, about would it be fair to say that the wages that were earned by the laboring caste women or the women in general, their wages were appropriated by the men in the family? Could the record shed any light on whether the wages were appropriated by the men of the family or by yeah, that's all I'm.
Yeah. So so no, the records are unfortunately not that detailed, but one of the things that is apparent from what I have read till now, whatever I've researched till now, is that these women are quite active about their about wages, and they are not some at least in the work site. But I know your question is about the home space, right? Whether within the homes the men are, but they seem to be very negotiating when their wages are wages. If you read the article that I have circulated, women protest in various ways. They leave the work site, they leave the earth, they just go and dump the earth anywhere, as site of protest if their wages are not given. So, but I haven't come across anything that, but I would say no, Amit. I would say doesn't seem so. No. Of course, this is not to deny that the hierarchies wouldn't exist within them, but it's difficult to say anything. Sorry. Yeah. In the absence of records.
I have a connected question, while talking about remuneration. The same context, there exists bonded labor, and then, there's also happening, the migration, large scale migration to the plantation, right? In that time, especially to Fuji and all, there's a lot of records happened, especially in the Awadh region, right? And then in the middle of all these, these people are getting wages, right? A different kind of mechanism come to play, right? Have you ever came across that kind of a discussion, like the bonded labor people, the people who are migrating to the plantation works, especially the women, any of that discussions?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, actually. Yeah, it's true that it was called indentured labor.
Yeah.
And after 1828 to 29, after slave labor was abolished by the British Empire, plantations, indentured labor was another form of slavery, actually. And people started to be very unfair contracts were made with laborers. And they started going to a lot of Caribbean island nations on plantations, you are right. But by the 1870s and 80s, by the time these famine public works come into picture, plantation labor has earned a very bad name for itself. And for example, like I'll give you an example, an event that occurred in northwestern provinces, Agra, if I'm not wrong. Something I recall is that the superintendent engineer is writing to the person above him and saying, there has been no work done for the last 2 days. And then they asked why, and they said the labor camp is completely empty. So then he says, why is that? Why is the labor camp empty? And he said, no, because there was a rumor, there was a cry of Moorish, M-U-R-I-S-H, Moorish, that went out and all women ran away. So basically, what had happened was that everybody thought that they are being brought together to take to Mauritius. And that was such a fear, and that was something that they didn't want to do, that everybody ran away. And that was one of the things that the family officials had to deal with, because a lot of times people thought that they will be taken to Bombay, they'll be taken to plantations, and they didn't want to go. So it was rather unpopular, I would say. So that's the only thing. But that has its own politics. Plantation labor has its own politics. Another, if you give me one more minute, when famine commission report came, when famine commission started to lay down the rules and so on, one of the things this thought would be useful was long distance migration. And they thought, why not settle these people somewhere else? And one or two efforts were made at settling people from, I think, again, this area to the something called Terai, the Terai region, which was considered to be inhospitable then, because it was swampy and so on. But it miserably failed. Nobody wanted to leave their homes and go to some other place or resettle. So that's why, apart from the early years, we do not find any mention of long distance resettlement in any of the records as a cure. So the government decided not to go ahead with it. Yeah. Thank you. Shaul, your mic is muted, so I can't hear you.
No, I'm done with my questions. Others, yeah, again.
Okay.
Yeah. Another question, any question? There are some question in chat box. Can you see, Madhavi?
Yeah, I can see them.
Yeah, just see that.
Yeah, so there's Pragya. That's Pragya, right?
Yeah.
Pragya's question.
Yeah. Pragya.
So Pragya is saying how caste system affects working of women in those days. What is the major reason for abolishment of Parda? So Pragya, like very broadly, caste system is actually part of every aspect of women's life, working, non-working. And in terms of working, it affected two main things. One was that whether you work or not outside your home. And second was the kind of work you do. So for example, by the late 19th century, when mechanization of a lot of rural work happened, like rice mills, sugar mills, and so on, there was a clear difference between what women from the dominant castes were doing and women from laboring castes were doing.
I think we've lost Madhavi.
Yeah, I think let's wait for some time.
Yeah. Hi, Madhavi. Yeah, you're muted. You're muted. Madhavi, you're muted. Yeah, Madhavi.
Yes, you're audible.
You were saying that there's a distinction between what dominant caste women were doing. At that point, we lost you.
I think there is some network problem again.
Yeah.
Hi, Madhavi, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yeah.
We lost you when you spoke about how there was a difference between dominant caste women and their labor, and at that point we lost you.
Yeah. So I've lost all the questions in the group chat, by the way. So
we'll read those out for you.
So,
we'll read those out
okay.
for you.
Yeah.
Okay. So as I was saying, so there was a difference. So it very much depended then on which caste you belong to, as well as your kinship networks. So that's how caste was important, because as I said, the questions of respectability, the questions of who works where were very important in determining which women worked, which didn't work. So that's why I would say caste was very important. And we can, those ideas of respectability, non-respectability have still, are still with us. And they were formative in what came to be known as middle class women. What is the kind of work women do, not do. And a lot of professions today, like say, and the norms around those professions have come to be affected by middle class respectability, which is nothing but caste respectability. So that's the short answer to a very long answer. But if you want, I can also like refer to you. There are works that have looked at, in the context of specific regions, what were the specific details of what caste did what, and what were women doing. The second part of your question was parda, abolishment of parda. So parda, in the common parlance, parda is seen as something, as a veil, right? Something you wear on your head. And if you, especially if you come from North India, you would imagine something like something that is that's the common understanding of parda, something that covers your head or even your face. But that's not the only, that is not that's a narrow definition of parda. The larger definition or broader definition of parda would be seclusion, right? So at least in history, we define parda not only just the veil, but also your mobility and your visibility in the public space. So even if formally parda is abolished or formally something is abolished, we still need to go a long way to ensure that women are visible and women are, their work is visible, and their visibility is not seen as a marker of their, of a marker of respectability and so on. These questions don't arise. That is still a long time to go, and that has to do with the way gender and labor interact, even in continuing to this day.
Okay, there is a question from Suraj. He asks, colonial famine public work was handled by Britishers. Why did the British culture not affect on the gender and caste system, though the Western culture do not believe in the untouchability? I think you got the question.
Yeah. Very good question. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So this is a very large debate in history of caste, but largely I will try to answer it from the perspective of labor history. I'm sorry, I didn't get the name of the person who asked this.
Suraj.
When came to India, British had their own understanding of gender, and they had their own understanding of social divisions, though not particularly caste, because caste is something they encountered in India. Usually in historiography, 1857, you must be knowing about the revolt of 1857. That's quite popular in, the movies and so on made also. So 1857 is seen as a watershed moment. Before 1857, the colonial state is seen as interfering, quote unquote, interfering in Indian matters. And after 1857, it's seen as a hands-off policy. Basically, what that means is that they believed, the colonial state believed, that from that, one of the reasons why the revolt of 1857 had happened was because British had become too embroiled in the private lives of Indians, which included caste and gender. And they believe that, and hence they believe that if we want to continue to rule India, govern it for our purposes, it is better to keep off reforms, right? So that's one of the general understanding. But from the labor point of view, it's more complicated. It's not that the British were there may be a few good British officers and few bad British officers, but what we need to understand is what was the colonial policy aimed at, And to what extent was it aimed at, was it a concern for them to eradicate caste in India? Would it help them or not? So in labor history, usually what people see is one example that I'll give you from there is that one of the burning questions is that, you know, caste is usually associated with non-modern, it's usually associated with traditional identities. It's usually associated with non-modern places, occupations, part of the Jajmani system and so on, right? But we continue to see it till today. We continue to see it in urban spaces, in medical colleges, everywhere, right? So,
Yes.
So this debate in Suresh, in labor history has a particular form in which this debate happens, which is this: that industries, the modern industries, did they have caste or did they not have caste? Because according to our understanding, if caste is a some rural vestige of social organization, then it should not exist in industries, right? But that's not what happens. What happens is that we see that in modern workplaces of colonial India, caste very much exists. This has been particularly pointed out by people who have worked on sanitation workers, who have worked on leather work, because here the large number of people who are working are Dalits, formerly known as untouchable caste. And it was seen that in these modern places, so-called modern, quote-unquote, modern spaces of work, caste continues to play an important role. And in order to reduce costs, in order to, through a mediated use of technology, through differential industrial training given to people from different castes, and through simply division of work, okay, caste comes to be replicated and reimagined within these spaces. So colonial state, in its, despite its policy of, despite its policy of, say, that good governance and so on, continue to give sort of reform. Caste comes to be reformulated within the British period, but its pernicious, its dangerous tendencies do not go down, right? Because they are continue to be reimagined in these spaces. So that's my answer. Yeah.
All right. Muhammad Zakaria Siddiqui has, he has two questions.
Yeah.
Was there any provincial level differences in between village and departmental works? And the next question, who were those private people who hired labor as part of the program?
Right. So provincial differences, yes, there were provincial differences, but I have taken, for this paper, I have taken two provinces which have similar sort of setup, or which have similar results, which was the Punjab and northwestern provinces. So there aren't many differences in these two provinces with respect to what I have said, Zakaria. But in Bengal, as I said, the density of village works was higher. So that must have had some other kinds of repercussions. But for my purposes, and so on and so forth, because there's also the Madras presidency. There's also the other presidency. So for my purposes or for my research, I have looked at 3 provinces and a bit of central provinces and Rajasthan. But this understanding of village works as under control of zamindars or lumbardars in Punjab, or middlemen and so on, and the departmental works under PWD control seems to be more or less a consistent factor throughout the country. More so because, as I quoted in my paper, it also comes in as a famine code suggestion in the Famine Commission report of 1898, and the Famine Commission reports were to be taken as a guideline throughout the country, with, of course, certain differences in provinces. But I would say more or less this, in this crucial aspect, this was the case, that PWD was looking after, or was conducting, there was complying to certain famine code rules, and the village works were mediated through these village elites. The other question about who are these private people? So the private employers. So this is an interesting question again. So the rural labor market at this time, and especially for construction workers, there were three people who wanted, you know, who were vying for this labor, so to say. One was the public construction carried out by the government through contractors and subcontractors. The other were the private companies. So there are a lot of private railway companies in India at this time. In Bengal, for example, there's something called the East India Railway Company and so on. And they were vying for this labor. And the third, the same rural labor, the same labor market had another, they were also part of the agricultural laborers whom the landlords would recruit for during harvest time and so on. So this had an interesting sort of implication for what was definitely in the middle of the 19th century, as to there was some kind of disjunction between the state and, you know, is state following the policy of laissez-faire or not? Is it interfering in the labor market or so on? So this was an important aspect of this labor market. There were different demands on this labor. Yeah. So those are the private employers I was talking about. Yeah.
So another question is about the details of caste specificity of those region, because some castes have marginal landholding and many were landless agricultural laborers. So
yeah,
can
Rahul
you talk
has asked that question.
Yeah,
There's
Rahul
a speaker of details of caste specificity in those regions, because some castes have marginal landholding and one landless. Yes, but Rahul, you're right that there is regional specificity. But again, as I said, that the western parts of the area that you saw in Punjab, there are some similarities, enough similarities to make the points that I made. But nonetheless, even if you have marginal land holdings, the idea that you were defined as a laboring caste, and hence the level of hierarchization that could take place in famine public works, meant that they could not use it as a bargaining tool at that time. The other thing is that because of famine scarcity, perhaps these marginal land holdings would not be very productive. So as I think I said in my presentation, so these castes included castes that didn't have any land as well as had some marginal land. More importantly for me, the historical implication of this kind of division, binary created between propertied and non-propertied, laboring and non-laboring, was that not only that these castes might have some marginal holdings, but they also had some usage rights, property rights, okay? And that came to be defined more and more strictly in favor of the dominant caste. But yeah, I don't have, it is possible to do further analysis and possibly see what is the difference. But I doubt if you will get that richness of archive will exist. Yeah.
So we'll take last question, right? So
yeah.
So yeah, Siddiq again have one question: where this private employees having legal requirement of complying with having minimum wages?
There's one more question, Shahul.
Where is that?
By Bendla Vamshi Krishna.
Is there a question?
There's a very short answer to Zakaria's question, so I'll give that.
Yeah.
So no, so Zakaria, no, there were no legal requirement of complying with any minimum wage, because as I said, these were famine code rules that were formed to ensure that people don't die off, during famines and starvation, and these were to a certain extent, these were implemented on famine public works, large departmental works, precisely because they were under the PWD. And things like task work, that you get money irrespective of how much you work or whether you finish, it's not piece work, it's task work, and a minimum wage, which was a very penal wage, it was, and there's a huge debate on that, very small amount of diet that was age and sex differentiated. that penal wage was the basis of this very minimum diet. But of course, but in the case of non-famine works and private employers who employed laborers, these laborers, even during famine times, were of course outside the ambit of this famine code. So they actually continued to recruit laborers through contract work. And there's very interesting exchange between private employers and the others, because because they kept saying that you are raising the wages for our works, and we are an important enterprise in India. We are building railways of India, and the workers are leaving our works and going to relief works and so on. But interestingly, when I did some calculations and I was looking at some archives, the private employees would not raise their wage even when the prices of grains had doubled or tripled. And in peace, which meant within piecework, you had to work twice or thrice more to actually reach the level of prices of grains. So of course, it wasn't a surprise that people were leaving the railway works and so on to go to these famine public works, because they continued to work under contract system, which had a tendency to depress the wages of these workers. And even within that contract system, they had not raised the wages to match the prices of grains. So that was the condition of private employment. Yeah.
Okay, well, Baindalas is more like a comment, and she says that no caste and gender-based wage differences is still existing in her place. That's what she has pointed out. Yeah, and that is what I comment more. Any other questions, or otherwise we could stop here? Thank you, Madhvi.
Yes.
As I mentioned, Amit, you have some announcement to make? Okay, okay. One second. All right. So it's a very enriching talk, and we learn a lot in your talk. Let me announce the next talk. Dr. Zakaria Siddiqui will be talking. He's the faculty at BITS Pilani, Hyderabad campus, and also adjunct faculty of the University of South Australia, right? And he'll be talking about rationalizing regional disparity in India, role of history and institutions. So this is the next talk. And now I would like to call upon Amrita V to deliver formal kind of vote of thanks. Thank you. Yeah.
So host disabled the unmute option for them. Can you please unmute them?
So here you heard what I talked right now about the next talk and all?
Yes, sir, we heard that.
Yeah.
But you disabled unmute option for them.
Yes.
Yes, sir, I can talk now.
Yeah, please.
So on behalf of Rural Development and Governance, this Hyderabad, under the School of Livelihood and Development, I would like to sincerely thank Madhvi Jha ma'am for her very insightful and acknowledging talk on gender and caste on famine public works in colonial North India. I would like to thank all our professors, publicity team, batchmates, and all the participants whose effort made the event more profound. If there are any shortcomings, feel free to inform us, and we'll be trying to rectify it in our best way possible in the future. Thank you everyone for your immense support, and we look forward to the same in the upcoming sessions as well. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Amrita.
Shahul, I would also like to thank everyone for listening to me and for asking such great questions. And thank you, Shahul, and thank you, Amit, and everybody else. And all the best for the Grameen Talks, future Grameen Talks.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
It's been a pleasure. Oh, yes. I think it was mentioned in the bio, but I am also from TIS, so it was a pleasure to come and talk.
True.
Yeah, even though virtually. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Madhvi. Yeah, we'll stop the program right now here. Thank you.
Yeah.
You can leave the meeting. Yeah.